Well, hi there, and congratulations on completing basic training, and welcome to Module 2, Drill Down to Ramp Up. You've turned a critical corner, and you're ready to double down on what you've learned. From basic training, you're educated in the basic principles of food quality, why they matter, and what to look for. Now let's drill down and talk about food quality in terms of our macronutrients. You remember those: carbs, protein, and fats. Our first stop is to learn all about carbs. This class is divided into parts A and B. In part A, which you're on right now, we'll talk about carb quality. And then in part B, we'll have our first real adventure in food label reading. And believe me, it will be an adventure. So, without further ado, let's talk about carbs. Our bodies use carbohydrates for fuel, for energy. Quality carbs include whole grains, legumes, which are beans and peas, vegetables, fruits, and sweeteners. Sweeteners based on sugars, that is. All carbs are broken down by our bodies to their simplest form, that is glucose, which gives us energy. Let's first talk about whole grains. I've divided grains into three categories: regular, glutinous, and grain-like seeds. Regular grains, for lack of a better word, are grains like oats, corn, rice, teff, and sorghum that don't fit into the other two categories. There are thousands of grains, so obviously this list is a short list of the short list of the short list. In fact, would you be surprised to know that there are more than 8,000 types of rice alone? Wow, that just blows my mind. Glutinous grains contain gluten, which I'll talk more about when we get to our protein class, which is coming right up after carbs. For now, let me just acknowledge that the idea that gluten is the devil's spawn has reached a fever pitch in our society, don't you think? I don't happen to think that gluten is evil per se, although it does cause digestive problems for certain people. In my opinion, people with any type of bowel disease, such as Crohn's or celiac or irritable bowel syndrome, should avoid glutinous grains, as well as the millions of people who are gluten intolerant, and I include myself in that category. But if you don't have a bowel disease or you're not gluten intolerant, I don't think there's anything wrong with eating glutinous grains. If they're whole grain, they're very nutritious. But because they contain gluten, they've gotten a bad rap, and I'll talk more about why this is in our class on protein. The last category is grain-like seeds, which include amaranth, millet, buckwheat, and quinoa. Some so-called grains are actually seeds, but they're commonly lumped into the grain category because they behave a lot like a grain. I think of grain-like seeds as a hybrid between grains and seeds. They have higher carb content than seeds, but higher protein content than most grains. Now let's talk about legumes. Would you be surprised to know that there are more than 11,000 different types of legumes? Who knew? And my mind is blown again. Legumes include beans, dried peas, lentils, and peanuts. Yes, peanuts. Many people think peanuts are a nut, but they're actually a legume. They behave like a nut, however, because they're higher in fat and lower in carbs than other legumes. Now let's move on to vegetables. I also break veggies down into three categories: starchy, leafy, and crunchy. I do this because there's a pecking order among these three categories in terms of their carb content. Generally, starchy veggies have higher carb content than leafy and crunchy veggies. There's also a pecking order among starchy veggies in terms of their carb content, and so I also break starchy veggies into three categories. The first category contains potatoes, yams, and corn, which have the highest carb content of all starchy veggies, almost as much as grains. The second category contains artichokes, green peas, parsnips, and winter squash, and these have about 75% of the carb content of the starchy veggies in the top category. The third category contains starchy veggies that actually contain very few carbs, those being beets, carrots, and pumpkin. This will become more important when we get into portions, and because of these differences in carb content, it wouldn't be reasonable to lump all starchy veggies in the same category when you're determining portions for a meal. Leafy and crunchy veggies are more straightforward. Leafy veggies have very few carbs, So few that they're really not an appreciable source of carbs, but they're extremely high in fiber and antioxidants, so we want to eat lots of them. Crunchy veggies include anything that doesn't fit into the other two categories, and they're generally on the crunchy side, so it's descriptive. Let's go back for a minute to the starchy veggies in category 3, which include beets, carrots, and pumpkin. I think of this group of starchy veggies as behaving more like crunchy veggies because their carb content is much closer to that of crunchy veggies than to other starchy veggies. And for that reason, we're going to treat them like crunchy veggies when we get to portions and menu planning. Now fruits. Notice that you don't see canned fruit here or fruit preserves, which are typically very high in sugar. Fresh, frozen, and dried. And I say some for the dried because I'm talking about dried fruit that is not preserved with sulfates or sulfides or laced with added sugar. As if fruit isn't sweet enough, many dried fruit producers actually sweeten their fruit with sugar. We don't need gratuitous sources of sugar. Natural foods have plenty of sugar and they're really quite sweet. Think about strawberries, watermelon, honeydew, sweet bell peppers, and carrots. Nature has an answer for your sweet tooth, but if you're highly addicted to refined foods, your taste buds are probably adulterated. That is, they're accustomed to an artificially high level of super sweetness that makes natural foods seem unsweet in comparison. In reality, they're plenty sweet, but if they don't register as sweet to you, your taste buds probably are adulterated. Give them time to normalize and you'll be able to experience the delicious sweetness of a fresh strawberry or a cold, delicious slice of watermelon on a hot summer day. No artificially super sweet refined food can hold a candle to it. Finally, we have sweeteners. We'll be going into some depth on sweeteners very shortly, so I'll list a few high-quality sweeteners here, but I'll leave our discussion until then. Now let's talk about poor quality carbs. And to talk about poor quality carbs, we're of course going to start out with processed foods. We've got thousands of them, probably hundreds of thousands. We are a nation that runs on processed foods. These foods are poor quality because they've got all kinds of toxins in them. Clearly, they've got GMO grains. We've learned that. They contain abundant quantities of rancid oils, which we're going to talk about in 2 classes. They contain refined grains, high sugar, and a bunch of additives. Now let's talk about fruit, and here I'm including canned. Have you ever had canned fruit? Does it taste anything like fresh fruit? Not in my book. Not only that, even if it's canned in water instead of heavy syrup, the minute you cut into fruit, or vegetables for that matter, the nutritional content starts degrading. Add to that heavy syrup, which is used as a preservative because sugar is a preservative as well as a sweetener, and you've got a low nutrient, high sugar product, which by my standards is certainly not a quality product. Same for jams and jellies. Contrary to many people's beliefs and hopes and desires, jam and jelly are not fruit. Saying a helping of jam is a fruit is like saying a squirt of ketchup is a vegetable. In fact, I think someone tried to get away with that and it went over like a lead balloon, quite reasonably. If you put some jam on your toast in the morning, you can't say, well, there's one of my fruits. It doesn't count. Most jams and jellies are very high in sugar. If you want a good fruit spread, get something that's just pureed fruit, but don't count it as a fruit. I classify pureed fruit as a condiment because it's used in small quantities to enhance flavor. And here's dried again, and again I say maybe because the poor quality dried fruit will have the added sugar and sulfates and sulfites. Now vegetables. Again, contrary to what a lot of people would like to think, French fries are not a vegetable. And again, the canned variety. Now, I grew up on canned veggies, and I know my mother would not like me saying that, but it's true. I remember the canned green beans and beets. My sisters and I had a very sophisticated system to dispose of our canned beets. We stuck a plastic baggie up our sleeves and spooned the beets into the baggie when no one was looking. I was quite shocked when I first had fresh green beans because they didn't taste anything like canned green beans. Fresh and canned are like Mars and Venus. There is nothing remotely similar about them. And any kind of vegetable that's been fried, deep fried, tempura fried, or stir fried in high heat is poor quality because you're going to get rancid oils, which immediately renders a once healthy vegetable unhealthy. Whenever you want to cook with oil, try light sautéing with olive oil or butter or raw coconut oil. Better yet, let me give you a preview of the portion system by saying that your portion system consists of a certain number of portions of each type of macronutrient, and you can think of these portions as your macronutrient budget. So you'll have a certain number of fat portions that you're going to learn about 2 classes from now. Instead of using your fat portions on sautéing, sauté your vegetables in a few tablespoons of organic broth or just some water with your favorite herbs and spices. It gives you a lot of flavor and it doesn't turn rancid, and you'll save your fat budget for other meals and snacks. Now, sweeteners. Just as we have high quality sweeteners, we have poor quality sweeteners, some of which are made from GMO foods, mainly GMO corn, which is used to make corn syrup and high fructose corn syrup. Again, I'm going to talk about these in detail in a few minutes, so I'll save that discussion for then. Now, what do all of these categories have in common? They're all nutrient poor, so they don't belong in your mouth. Now let's talk about refined grains because they're in all processed grain foods, whether you find them at a grocery store or at an artisan bread shop. A fancy name and package does not make something a quality product, no matter how pretty that package is, although food companies try very hard to give you that impression. These refined grain products have been stripped of their nutrients and fiber. Let's take a look at the components of a whole grain and see what happens when it gets refined. The whole grain is alive. We've talked a lot about the synergies you get from all of the nutrients in whole foods. A whole grain is a whole food, so you get those synergies. The endosperm is the starchy part of the grain. The bran and germ are loaded with nutrients and fiber, and all of these nutrients work together synergistically within the whole grain. And that's the power of it. And that's why it can go rancid, because it's alive. But when you refine a grain, all of the nutrients are stripped out. Basically, it's dead. It was once alive, and we kill it. Now, why do companies use refined grains in their grain products? So the product will last 500 years like a Twinkie. Of course, if there's nothing in the product that can spoil, there's nothing of value in it, but it can stay on the shelf for a long time waiting to be sold, and that's the value to the company. To make up for the fact that the nutrients and fiber have been stripped from the grain, these processed foods are often fortified with synthetic vitamins and minerals. You see this very commonly in sweetened breakfast cereals. Now, do you think, though, that these synthetic vitamins added to dead flour will give you the synergies of a live whole food? I'm going to pretend that I heard you say, no. These highly processed foods are also high in additives, such as artificial flavors and colors. How many breakfast cereals and other refined grain products do you see that say artificial strawberry flavor, or artificial blueberry flavor, or artificial fill-in-the-blank flavor? You now know from basic training what's in those artificial flavors. Let's talk about energy crashes for a minute. Are energy spikes followed by crash and burn part of your pack of problems? We'll be talking about how to combine foods strategically to banish these energy crashes and get high sustained energy from our meals and snacks in the last class of this module. But let me just introduce how energy crashes happen now. Our bodies metabolize sugar very quickly because sugar requires very little work to break down into glucose. And remember that I said that our bodies break down all carbs into glucose, which they then use for energy. In fact, sucrose, which is just refined white table sugar, is a combination of glucose and fructose. So when we eat sugar, our bodies break it down very quickly, and our blood sugar rises very quickly to give us an energy spike. Refined grains metabolize very much like sugar because there's nothing but starch left after they've been stripped. So they also require very little work for our bodies to break down into glucose. So highly processed foods loaded with refined grains and sugars, such as pastries and Pop-Tarts, cookies and cakes, bagels and pastas, and most breads and breakfast cereals will be metabolized just like sugar and will get that energy spike that we all love. The problem is that that spike will always be followed by a crash and burn of equal or greater magnitude. And what will you likely be reaching for to get your energy back up quickly? More refined food, of course. And this turns into a vicious cycle of energy spikes, crashes and burns, carb cravings, and binging that will further damage your metabolism and result in malnourishment, weight gain, and other serious health problems. Let's look at some of the names companies use on food labels for refined grains. Food companies will often use names that sound whole. Unbleached flour. A lot of people think this means whole. No, it just means it's unbleached, but very much refined. And what about enriched? Have you seen enriched wheat flour on a food label and thought, okay, it's enriched, so it must be good? No. In fact, it's enriched because it's had synthetic vitamins added to it, which, as we just learned, is a tip-off that it is refined. My favorite is stone ground wheat flour. Stone ground sounds so legitimate, doesn't it? Well, if it doesn't say stone ground whole wheat flour, it's refined. The same applies to corn and rice and any other flour. Just because rice says long grain or medium grain doesn't mean it's whole grain. When a food contains whole grains, the company will want you to know it will be labeled whole. Also, watch out for statements like multi-grain, which mostly just means multi-refined grain. That is, the company has combined multiple types of refined grain. That's it. But the company knows multi-grain is a buzzword that people look for and equate with whole grain. They're not lying. It is multi-grain, but it's how we interpret the term that matters, and most people interpret it as whole grain, which is what the company hopes that they'll do, so they'll buy the product. The more labels you read, the more you're going to see this. One final term to look out for is made with whole grains, which simply means there's some unknown amount of whole grain in the product. Companies can advertise their products as made with whole grain if they put just a smidgen of whole grain in the product. So a loaf of bread could contain 95% refined grain and 5% whole grain, and then say that it's made with whole grains on the packaging. A grain product that's 100% whole grain will state just that, 100% whole grain. Otherwise, there will be some mix of whole and refined grains in the product. Even companies that generally offer high-quality foods will have some food products that are a combination of whole and refined grains, but these foods are typically heavily weighted toward the whole grain side. The presence of synthetic vitamins in the ingredients list will tell you immediately that the ratio of refined to whole grains is very high. And now let's shift gears and talk about sweeteners. And here I'm going to reveal myself just a little bit. Now, I was quite surprised when I saw this. Yes, it's mine, or should I say it was my mother's. I used to be a Smith before I was a Thomas. This is what my mother got when she left the hospital after I was born. And if you'll notice, there's a formula on it because I was born during what I call the American Victorian age, when breastfeeding was considered a bad, bad thing. We've done it for thousands of years, but for this brief moment in time, there was just something very, very wrong with doing it. Clearly, this is what someone thought was better than breast milk. So what it is a combination of evaporated milk and corn syrup. That's right, feed the baby sugar. Here's a close-up of these ingredients. We've got evaporated milk, which is actually pretty high in sugar because the water is evaporated out of it. About 5 teaspoons, in fact. Milk actually has a decent amount of sugar in the form of lactose. So if you take all the water out, the sugar becomes concentrated. And then we've got 4 teaspoons of Karo syrup, which would be 4 teaspoons of sugar because it's pure sugar. Is it any wonder I grew up a sugar addict? I was fed this from day one. And I wasn't the only one. A whole generation, millions of children, grew up on sugar and no one blinked an eye. My sugar addiction took years to overcome because, first of all, I had to understand that I had one. For years, I was extremely sick from what I ate, and I didn't have a clue that what I ate was causing all of my health problems. So first I had to figure that out, and then I had to wean myself off sugar. So this is what we're up against. Now let's talk about poor choice sweeteners versus better choice sweeteners. Now this is far from an exhaustive list. There are many other sweeteners, but these are the sweeteners you'll commonly see on food labels. Also, let me mention that a few better choice sweeteners listed here are not sugars because they don't contain any carbs, and those are stevia and Lakanto. Also listed are a few sugar alcohols, which also contain very few carbs. But I'm talking about sweeteners, so for simplicity's sake, I'm including all of these here. Now don't worry, I'm not going to go through every sweetener on this list, but I am going to spend some time on this slide because I've found that most people are very confused when it comes to sugar, so let's get some clarity right now. The poor choices are rampant in refined foods. They have no nutritional value, and they could also be made from GMO ingredients. You get nothing but empty calories, and people who eat highly processed foods as staples in their diets are often malnourished in addition to being overweight or obese. The better choices have some nutrients and/or they metabolize slower. That is, some of them won't give you the energy spike and crash that sugar and refined carbs give you. That said, sugar is sugar. Even the better choice sugars are just that, sugar but with some nutrients. So your body will extract and process the nutrients and then process the sugar just as it would process any other kind of sugar. And that means that the presence of a better choice sweetener in a food does not make it good quality in and of itself. Any food that has a huge quantity of added sugar is not a quality food, whether it contains poor choice sweeteners or better choice sweeteners. Now I want to talk briefly about fructose and high fructose corn syrup because they're everywhere, and they're everywhere because they're cheap inputs for food companies. Fructose is almost twice as sweet as sucrose. However, the quantities of fructose and high fructose corn syrup used in refined foods are not reduced to compensate for the extra sweetness. So people who eat these refined foods are getting huge quantities of these sweeteners from multiple sources every day. And here's an important point that confuses people. I've heard a lot of people say, well, fructose is in fruit, so it must be good. Well, unlike fructose in whole foods, the fructose in processed foods is highly refined and highly concentrated. According to Dr. Robert Lustig, who's the professor of pediatrics at the University of California, San Francisco, the problem, apart from the fact that people just consume way too much of these sweeteners, is that your brain doesn't register feelings of fullness when you consume them, which sets you up to overeat when your diet is high in refined foods, which is the case for most Americans. I'll also add that high fructose corn syrup is made from GMO corn. If you want to know more about fructose and high fructose corn syrup and sugar in general, I suggest watching Dr. Lustig's YouTube video called Sugar the Bitter Truth, which you can find easily on the internet. Let's talk about low to no carb sweeteners. Stevia and Lakanto have no carbs at all. So, as I mentioned, they're technically not sugars, but I'm including them in this discussion because they are sweeteners. Stevia is a plant that's been used for thousands of years as a sweetener in many cultures. It's 200 to 300 times sweeter than sucrose, so you need just a smidgen to sweeten. It has no calories and no effect on blood sugar, which means no energy spikes and crashes, and it doesn't cause tooth decay. What a deal! Because of this, it's my sweetener of choice. However, since being approved by the FDA as a sweetener in the US, we've got a glut of stevia-based refined products, including soft drinks. And just because something is sweetened with stevia doesn't make it good. For example, don't confuse stevia-based soft drinks with nourishing fluids. Lakanto is similar to stevia in that it has no calories, no effect on blood sugar, and it doesn't cause tooth decay. But it's similar to sucrose in its consistency and its level of sweetness, which makes it a really good sugar substitute in recipes. It's very popular in Japan, although it's not so well known in the US. Lakanto is made with erythritol, which is a sugar alcohol that I'm going to talk about in a second, and lohongo, which is a medicinal fruit found in China. If you want to try Lakanto, you may be able to get it at your local health food store. Otherwise, you can definitely buy it online. Sugar alcohols are used in a lot of diabetic foods because they have a negligent effect on blood sugar. That is, they're very low in carbs. These sweeteners also don't promote tooth decay, and so they're used in a lot of toothpastes and sugar-free gum, especially sorbitol and xylitol. Mannitol and sorbitol are in the poor choice category because they can cause immediate and severe digestive problems in a lot of people. Have you ever eaten some sugar-free gum or candy and then got instant gas, bloating, or diarrhea? That's the sugar alcohol. Xylitol and erythritol are in the better choice category because they aren't known to produce these digestive side effects. Now, before we move on, I want to point out the footnote corresponding to raw honey. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that raw honey not be given to infants under the age of 1 because of the rare possibility of being infected by the bacteria that causes botulism. According to the Academy, once a baby reaches 1 year of age, his or her digestive system is mature enough to kill any botulism germs. Now, I increased this to 2 years of age just as an extra precaution. So let's review some important points. Just because a food contains a better choice sweetener doesn't mean it's good. To your body, sugar is sugar. All sugar sweeteners will affect your blood sugar and are converted to fat and excess cholesterol when you eat too much of them. Here's my rule of thumb. Buy plain and sweeten yourself with a better choice sweetener so you can control the amount and quality of the sweeteners you consume. I'm going to leave you with this handy sugar conversion chart so that you can start making healthy sweetener substitutes in your recipes. You're going to find that you don't have to give up any of your favorite recipes. You're just going to learn how to healthify them by identifying the poor quality ingredients in your recipes and finding healthy substitutes. I've divided this table into groups of sweeteners based on the quantity exchanged for 1 cup and 1 tablespoon of sugar. All of the sweeteners in the first group have a 1-to-1 exchange with sugar, so you would use the same amount of them as you would sugar in any of your recipes. For the next group, which includes pure maple syrup and raw honey, you would use 3/4 of the amount of sugar called for in a recipe. For the third group, which includes agave syrup and brown rice syrup, you would use 2/3 of the amount of sugar called for in a recipe. Then we get to stevia, which is so sweet that you literally need a fraction of the amount of sugar called for in a recipe to achieve the same level of sweetness. Keep in mind that using liquid sweeteners or stevia in place of sugar will change the consistency of a recipe. Liquid sweeteners, of course, because you're adding extra liquid to the recipe, which may already have liquids from milk or water or eggs and so forth. I don't necessarily strive to substitute a granulated sweetener for sugar just to keep the consistency exactly as it would be in the original recipe. I do use coconut palm sugar, but just as often I use agave syrup and stevia. With stevia, the consistency will be different because you're reducing the quantity of dry ingredients. And this doesn't bother me either, and I found my recipes to still turn out delicious, at least according to my taste buds, and that's all that matters because I'm the one eating it. You can do your own experimenting. I very often use a combination of stevia and agave or stevia and coconut palm sugar because I always want to reduce the amount of sugar in my recipes. I achieve the level of sweetness I want, I reduce the level of sugars by using the stevia, and I keep the consistency of the recipe closer to what it would be in the original recipe. Because in general I think recipes call for way too much sugar to begin with, I also have the rule of thumb of reducing the amount of sugar in a recipe by 25%, and then I calculate the amount of sweetener to substitute. It always turns out sweet enough for me. Well, congratulations! You've reached the end of Part A, and now you know everything you need to know about carbs and sugars. Our next stop is back down the rabbit hole for Part B of this class as we have our adventure in label reading. And this is another class that, just like our toxins class, I think will shock you when you see the claims that companies make on the front of a box and then the reality that's hidden on the back of the box in the food label. This is going to be like learning a whole new language. And when you learn it, you will never again be fooled by false and misleading claims that have no doubt led you to buy a lot of junky food that you thought was healthy. This knowledge will be with you for life. Now, before I sign off, let's go over your action items. Of course, continue with all of the action items that you've been doing from Module 1. This includes drinking your nourishing fluids and adhering to the food quality principles that you learned. Then I want you to start eating a cultured food or drinking a cultured nourishing fluid every day. The probiotics will start healing your gut. I've listed a few examples here that are very easy to fit into your diet. If you haven't heard of kefir, it's like a liquid yogurt with even more probiotic content than yogurt. It's delicious and it's extremely healing to your gut. Of course, with yogurt and kefir, you should be eating only the plain unsweetened variety. And if you want to sweeten it up, just add a dash of stevia. If you've already started drinking kombucha or Kavita, you're covered. As an alternative, you can get yourself a quality probiotic supplement. My preferred brand is Natural Factors. Now, if you see a probiotic supplement on a regular store shelf, pass it by. Probiotics should be refrigerated. So if you want to use a supplement, make sure you find it in the refrigerated section of the store and keep it refrigerated at home. And also take it with food. Okay, great job on Part A. I'll see you soon for Part B of Adventures in Label Reading. You're going to enjoy this. We'll see you soon. Cheers.